Good evening, everyone. My name is Margaret Kirk, and I'm a visiting critic of building technology here at AAP. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing Christiana Moss of Studio Ma, the Strauch Visiting Critic in Sustainable Design. The Strauch Visiting Critic in Sustainable Design lecture was established by Hans B.Arch 1980 and Roger 1978 Strauch to ensure that Cornell Department of Architecture students and faculty are supported in their efforts to advance research and innovative design solutions associated with consequences of global climate change. I thought I would begin my introduction, and Caroline, I'm glad you're here, by continuing the last lecture's theme with a bad joke. And of course, this is participatory. Knock, knock. Swaro. Swaro you today. Hope everybody's doing well at the end of their week. Is that bad? It's bad. So I've had the pleasure of getting to know Christiana well these past months as we are hosting the Desert Studio together, bringing the issues of the desert southwest of Phoenix to Ithaca. It's a studio that explores a nature-engaged bioclimatic approach to the built environment for climate adaptation, ecological restoration, and resiliency, especially when facing a climate crisis. Currently, we are examining the lessons of the cactus. And yet, while Christiana's obvious positivity and appreciation for a very bad joke is evident, her work confronts very serious issues of social injustice and climate change. Architecture, as we know, can be a part of the problem or the solution. Studio Ma, through their work, seeks ambitious solutions in architecture for what is possible. Not what can be done, but what should actually be done. Christiana herself is not only a distinguished figure in the field, but her inspiring work continuously pushes the boundaries of both design and sustainability. She has been recognized with numerous awards, honestly too many to probably list or else this would go on forever, which includes a Project of the Year award from the US Green Building Council, and is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, a distinction bestowed upon 3% of its members. Christiana is renowned for her innovative approach to architecture, blending aesthetic excellence with environmental consciousness. Her portfolio spans from thought-provoking urban spaces to cutting-edge sustainable designs, each project reflecting her commitment to enhancing the human experience through thoughtful and impactful design. In her lecture today, Christiana will be offering insights into her creative process, the challenges she faces, and the groundbreaking solutions she devises. This is an exciting opportunity to gain firsthand knowledge from someone whose vision and expertise are shaping the future of architecture. Personally, I have had the distinct pleasure of witnessing her dedication and passion, learning about her vision for the future of architecture during weekend hikes through the gorges of Ithaca, and discussing the significance of the architect's role now and into the future. And while that can weigh heavily on the designer, Christiana expresses it simply. She merely wants to design buildings that give back, both to society and the environment, inherently connected ideals and symbiosis. Deceptively straightforward, this comes with learning from and connecting to our natural environment. As Christiana will most likely tell you, this challenge is what inspires her and excites her to get up every morning to face these issues head on. She has a stimulating view of the future of architecture and architects, and it's one that we aspire to impart in the Desert Studio. So with that, please join me in warmly welcoming the Strauch Visiting Critic in Sustainable Design, Christiana Moss.
Thank you so much, Maggie, and it's been such a pleasure to get to know you. I have to say, you're the only person that I know of who has a passion for both woofy analysis and dogs. Now, they have nothing to do with one another, but if anyone can figure out how to put those two things together, I know you can. It's your next dissertation, maybe. So, yeah. Thank you so much. So, I'm Christiana Moss. I'm a founding principal of Studio Ma. We're a small but mighty architecture and planning firm based in Phoenix, Arizona. where we live on purpose. And I'll get to that. And we've been steadily working on buildings around the world for the last 20 years. But before I get to that, I want to tell you a story about a woman named Cesaria Evora. Cesaria Evora was maybe Cabo Verde's most famous musician. Known as the Barefoot Diva, she really has commanded the imagination of Cabo Verdeans and the world. Cabo Verde is a small archipelago about 500 miles off the west coast of Africa. And in the 19th century, Cabo Verde was a huge and important part of the whaling trade. And that relationship between whalers in Rhode Island and Boston and whalers in Cabo Verde started a strong and lasting diplomatic relationship between the United States and its country. Cut to a few years ago, when we started working on a new embassy compound for Praia, the capital of Cabo Verde, and came to know of Cesaria. We came to know of her because we were following how we approach every project, through a mix of deep local research, always seeking to engage in and understand local values and what our buildings are going to really mean for the people who use them. And the willingness to always be informed by something that may not initially seem architecturally relevant, but that has profound architectural impacts. So we came across the story of Cesaria, who was Cabo Verde's most famous musician, which enlightened us and illuminated our fuller, more social understanding of Cabo Verde as a place with a profound sense of hospitality, a concept known in Cabo Verdean Criollo as mora besa, and a dedication to music. Music and mora besa as forms of resistance and resilience. So Cabo Verde also has a very difficult and complex history as a central part of the transatlantic slave trade, and has also historically been a very challenging place for citizens to eke out an existence. We wanted to acknowledge both the challenge of this history and also emphasize the spirit of resistance that we found, the way that music has played a central role in the national imagination as Cabo Verde moved past that history and is now considered the strongest democracy in Africa. We also learned from the other local post staff whom we interviewed and discovered these local employees often work in our US embassies for decades longer than a typical diplomatic post from the US. And so we wanted to interview them and speak to them. And when we did, they asked for a place that they could use to gather and eat and play music. So we researched these kinds of spaces in Cabo Verde, from the landscape to the domestic and civic scales. And they told us about the local concept of a quintal, which is really more of a domestic, kind of informal gathering place, courtyard, where Cabo Verdeans typically gather to play music and share stories. And this concept of the quintal became the fundamental driver for our new embassy compound. And this has taught us so much about how we approach architecture that is both local and global. So I want to give you a brief background of our practice before we return to Cabo Verde, which we will do. We founded Studio Ma a little over 20 years ago. The practice is run by me, Christopher Alt, who's my partner in life and work, and Tim Kyle. And Chris and I founded it in 2003 with Dan Hoffman, who's now our principal emeritus. Chris and I also did our thesis together here at Cornell about 30 years ago. Our first project together was the winning entry of an NEA Public Works sponsored competition that took a research-driven look at Phoenix's canal system and the Salt River. And it set the stage for how we work together even now. It taught us a lot about the desert that we really didn't realize at first. So I grew up on Fire Island and also in New York. And then I went to school here, right, in Ithaca, which is where I met Chris. So I didn't have a lot of desert exposure necessarily. But I knew there was something about Phoenix that I found fascinating. Even then, it was known for its extreme heat and drought, but we soon discovered its incredible resiliency. The desert is an amazing place once you get to know it. It's very alive. It has a comprehensive ecosystem all its own. And over the last 2 decades, we've come to see the desert as a laboratory for us. We learned from this project about where our water comes from, and that our city was once a huge network of canal systems. So this is a map of these ancient canals overlaid on the modern and pretty ubiquitous cardinal grid of Phoenix. So we also needed a name, so a little bit about Studio Ma. So, when people get together and form offices, they typically look at, their initials and their last name, and we had HAM, so we were like, ham, or maybe ahem, or I don't know, ma, maybe ma. So we took a look at what these words might mean. We really didn't want this to be our initials. We wanted to be something bigger, something that really talked about having a collaborative practice, which is what we believed in and what we still believe in completely. So we found this amazing word, ma. It's a Japanese term, and of course, 1 syllable, and yet it means it's an incredible concept. It's essentially the spatial idea of wabi-sabi. So it's this idea of negative space or experiential space. It's kind of the counter to the formation, say, of Rome, where you have obelisks that have created a city. Ed Bacon talks about that a lot. And it's more like an Eastern idea where you have negative space. And moving through that negative space, or the space between, is what ma means. So again, very complex idea in 1 syllable. That is Japan. And we hope to make a pilgrimage there soon, eventually. We haven't done it yet. But that's where Studio Ma comes from, because we are very concerned about negative space, experiential space, and it also happens to be somewhat feminine, which I also like. So I want to give you, I guess, a little bit of a background about the project that we did here. Some of these canals are used to this day as part of the modern conveyance of water. So that inner loop connects 3 cities, and that's how we get our water. And we created a trail out of these loops, and that was the design problem. So we quickly became inspired by the incredible adaptation of nature in the face of extreme heat and drought. And we choose to live in Phoenix because we're deeply inspired by this place of extreme heat and drought, which honestly, a lot of places are going to be like Phoenix in the coming decades and centuries. And being here in the middle of drought and heat and urban concentration, but also, like I said, resilience and regeneration, from water recycling strategies to inspiration from desert flora, it gives us a really remarkable lens through which we see not only the rest of our practice, but the world. And here's our studio, where it all happens. My philosophy is one of generosity and responsibility. I feel tremendously inspired by people and places in nature, and I believe we have an obligation as people living on this planet and as architects to act positively upon nature, to become an explicit part of a regenerative ecosystem instead of taking. And that belief has led us to develop a set of core values for how we approach design over the last 20 years, and we formalized them in various ways, but briefly they are sustainability at any scale, leadership through partnership, and advocacy and value for all. And what this means is that we want to think about sustainability not only in terms of design, but construction. And that usually means doing a lot more with a lot less. And also always being aware of our impact on natural systems and ecologies. We believe that architecture should be accessible to everyone, and so with every building, we look for ways to engage and connect it with a wider public, even if it's a private or small semi-private structure. We believe that the best leadership comes not from one person taking charge, but from a deep partnership with experts in multiple fields. We learn from our clients, and they learn from us. We learn from each other, and we learn from scientists and engineers and other experts. And most fundamental to our practice is an optimism. And I'm sure you hear all about I hear about being optimistic, and people might tell you to be optimistic, and then you read the news, and well, it's difficult to be optimistic, and so don't read the news. But seriously, I'm telling you, I live in Phoenix, and it's one of the hottest cities in the country. And this summer we had over 100 days where the temperature was over 100 degrees. I think we're getting out of it. It looks like it might be next week. And it gets hotter every year, and for some people that means it gets scarier. And I think there's a huge tension between the optimism that I feel because I understand, and I see how many tools we have as architects, and I understand the global pessimism about our country and our ecology, and I see that so many other people feel less than optimistic. So I'm here to maybe tell you in part why I'm so optimistic, and to tell you some stories about some projects, and also tell you about some tools that we use every day in our practice. And I'm going to use the lens of the desert to explore these projects, even though not all of them are in the desert. We've learned from this place of extreme heat, and we've learned that we can adapt, as nature has, in order to become more resilient in any climate. So there are a few fundamental questions that we ask ourselves with each project. Each question is a singular lens to a larger architectural and design world, and these are the questions. Where does our water come from, and where is it going? Where is the sun in the sky? And the next question, it's coming. And we're going to do that in here. Thank you. How do we have a positive ecological and social impact on a site? And how do we produce or create more than we take? Each project is looked at through this lens of 4 questions. And there are 4 projects that I'm going to share with you that each reflect our responses to these questions. And you may wonder why we ask ourselves these questions, which has everything to do with both being in the desert and seeing our work as connected to its place. And we find when you ask these questions, amazing things happen. So first, I'm going to show you where the magic happens again and show you a bit about how we think and come to ask the questions we ask. This is our office again in Phoenix, and believe it or not, it's a former dentist's office, which is incredibly generic, dark, dingy, and like a lot of existing building stock throughout cities, pretty, boring. But we had a vision for this, and here's what we transformed it into. So this is a nearly net zero building, and we utilized all of the existing high embodied carbon materials, concrete slabs, masonry walls, and we harvested the existing framing, raised the roof, and wrapped it in a carbonized wood screen. The screen is optimized to nearly eliminate all of the direct solar radiation on the thermal skin of the building, and not all of it, and maybe this is from my office. Yes, there's a little bit that happens right in the west in the afternoon on a particular time of day that's really, really annoying. But anyway, that's an inside. It's for my crew that's probably listening. So knowing where the sun is in the sky is essential to understanding how to design with this goal of reducing external heat loads. Shade is an essential part of survival in the desert. The saguaro cactus's crenellations flatten, and it expands when it fills with water. And when it dries up, its ribs become deeper, self-shading its photosynthetic skin. We design the space to naturally ventilate for 7 to 8 months of the year, and to include a biome, a space between the enclosure of the building and the carbonized wood screen that's planted with low water and low light plants, stepping down the ambient temperature between the hot desert air and our indoor comfort zone. With our photovoltaics, it operates at nearly net zero energy. Our goal is to get to net positive energy and water. It's definitely a journey, especially in the desert, and we quickly discovered the complexity of our water cycle in Phoenix. So we initially sought to have an on-site water recycling treatment that went from black water to potable, integrated into our facility, and we quickly learned that this wasn't helpful after we educated ourselves about what the actual water cycle is in our city. And this is it. So you can see that one simple question, where does your water come from and where is it going, can lead to very complex answers. For us in Phoenix, This involves that ancient canal system dating back 4,000 years in some parts, the geomorphology of the state of Arizona, and a wastewater treatment facility that's operated continuously since 1940 and provides all the cooling water needed for the only desert nuclear power plant in the US. So it's complicated. And the more we understand about these systems, the more we can educate ourselves and our clients to make more ecologically sound and positively impactful design decisions. So we moved our office into this building in 2017 when we were working on a project for Arizona State University called Fusion on First, which I'll get to. I remember the first time we had someone in the office and the thrill we felt showing them how principles of shade and our desert biome, while simple, can be so effective. By that time we moved into our office, we had finished several major projects, the first of which, ASU's Memorial Student Union, I won't spend too much time on, but it was our first big project. And we finished it from initial meeting through design and construction and completion in 164 days. Yes, 164 days. It was 100,000 square feet, over $50 million in today's construction dollars, and in a way, we were kind of ambulance chasers, more like fire truck chasers. So the plaza you see on the left was what we were working on, and a terrible fire broke out in one of the rooms in the union, and it was actually a smoker who was, I think, hanging out in the chair storage room, and I swear we had absolutely nothing to do with it. But horrible fire. This is the center of all kinds of hubs of activity. 35,000 people go to this union every single day, and it needed to be put back and rebuilt as quickly as possible. It also had a host of code violations, including lacking about 50 feet in exiting width from assembly spaces on the second floor. So it was huge. We had about 4 or 5 different stairs we had to deal with. It was intense. But we figured it out, and we did it. We got it done in 4 months. And completing that project gave us extraordinary confidence. It was pretty much impossible, so think about this. Again, programming, designing, doing 300 plus sheets of drawings, and then building this thing in 4 months. And yet we did it. And it set the tone for our office going forward. We're people who will work incredibly hard to get incredibly complicated things done. And we also care about joy. I know that joy is a tricky topic, and particularly presently. It's hard in many ways to think about the role of architecture in creating joy. But if you think about buildings that are really incredible, and I was personally very influenced by the work of Sverre Fenn, whose Nordic Pavilion is, when Chris and I studied in Norway, this is what this is, and they do create a sense of joy. And to actually make trees more beautiful, in this instance, through the presence of the built environment, is pretty incredible. And we want our end users, visitors, students, deans, to feel joy when they're in our buildings. And getting to that joyful end product isn't always going to be joyful on the way. Getting your designs to be constructed properly is very hard. Reaching consensus can get tricky. Figuring out how to ameliorate existing social inequities is very difficult. But we're committed to approaching architecture through the lens of ultimately creating something joyful. And this challenge excites us. And honestly, when you have a purpose and you have your why, hard work is joyful. At NAU, Northern Arizona University, or as they like to call it, Native American University, for instance, we partnered with a Pueblo planner, Ted Hohola, to engage students from 64 Native American tribes so that we could learn about the difficult, complicated, and yet still joyful and resilient history of Native Americans, to see how our student center could actually improve their existing experiences on campus. And these students, we went through charrettes, and they told us about their stories. It was actually all around this idea of migration, beautiful stories, difficult stories, visual stories. And these students were often culturally alienated and removed from their community on campus and their cultural practices. So together, we designed and co-designed with them a center that they feel is completely theirs, 64 different tribes who feel like this is their space. And we believe that every building should improve what's already there. We've also created consensus at big institutions like Princeton University. And there we designed a graduate student housing to help them build community and feel more connected to each other and the campus, which came from a lot of thinking about groups of people, in this case graduate students, who are not simple, homogeneous groups, but it's a community of people with very different needs. There are families, there are couples, there are people who have actual mobility, there are people who do not have mobility. There are all kinds of different people in that group of graduate students. And we designed a place where all groups of these students could find a place to belong and find community together, regardless of their stage in life and family situation. Places to cook, places to convene, places to belong together. And in this process, we also restored the natural flows of water from campus to its wetlands and lake. At UC Berkeley, we're working on a huge student life and space equity plan that seeks to redistribute resources to meet the needs of diverse students, and that creates a place where students can convene, create community, and have a home base on an expanding campus. And we share with our clients and partners a sense of optimism, this idea that you can actually have institutional visions that include everyone at the table. This project in particular, which was run by their university architect, while they did a master plan, they acknowledged that a lot of people weren't at the table. And so this plan arose out of that, and the idea that they could meet with all of the different people, especially those that are student-facing, and students themselves, to make sure that this plan reflected their needs. So this is the work we do, and we really provide people with a sense of optimism, reassurance, which we hope brings them joy. And now to those questions and lessons that we've learned from the desert that I promised. So where does water come from and where is it going? This is our new embassy compound in Praia, Cabo Verde. This is the project where we heard about Cesaria and learned about the quintal. It also asked us to think about water in a way we'd never thought about before. So 99% of the time, Praia is in a drought state. The city is on the leeward side of the chain of islands that make up Cabo Verde, and it's very, very dry. That dryness is, of course, something we're used to working with in Phoenix, and it's probably one of the reasons why we were selected for the project. And a dry climate will set up a certain architectural approach. We need to think about how to make the most out of every drop of water. And that means here in Praia, fully recycling all of our wastewater. We use every drop of condensate that's produced by the building's mechanical systems, which, although we're in a temperate climate, we need this due to necessary security issues. But here's where it gets sticky. Once a year, it floods in Praia. And so we found ourselves designing for these two polar extremes, total drought and epic flood. The new embassy compound, or NEC as it's called, there are a lot of acronyms in the State Department, is sited in a neighborhood known as Várzea, or floodplain, which meant that we needed to design both for extreme heat and drought, and a marine environment, which is highly corrosive, and also the potentially intrusive presence of floodwater. So designing the entire site around the central quintal gathering space and using this space and the sequence of spaces around it to slow down, convey, and collect water across the site, which includes more than 20 meters of grade change from its highest point, which is on the upper left-hand corner, and its lowest point on the bottom right. It became essential to the design. All of the buildings that make up the embassy are related volumes that are organized in plan around this quintal space. And the open end of the quintal is actually a place where nature engages with it. They're also stacked like stones of varying depths and heights vertically around this quintal, adjusting in height depending on the program and the context. And one of the things we also heard when we interviewed local staff was about really what made Cabo Verde feel like Cabo Verde. And they talked about stone quite a lot. In particular, basalt and also a light stone, a white stone. So the two stones in combination really identified a place as Cabo Verdean. So some of these volumes, like at this entrance where the public comes to get their visas, are scaled to address the adjacent residential neighborhoods. But as you move through into the lower areas of the embassy, the volumes begin stacking, and the ground plane is designed to completely flood. You can see here the Quintal volume, which is made of basalt, and it's 5 meters, it's on the right-hand side, it's 5 meters actually above this entry area. So you emerge up to this Quintal space. This whole ground plane is designed to flood, as I mentioned. The walkways are designed like docks to anticipate this event. The areas that are highest in elevation are reforested to slow down the progression of floodwater to the Quintal. The main embassy building connects the lower flooding areas of the site to the elevation of the Quintal, 5 meters above the lower entrances. The Quintal expresses itself as a basalt volume in the main public gallery of the embassy through a stair and a double height space, linking the diplomatic public spaces to the shaded outdoor spaces. This is a view from the reforested area of the site to the Quintal. So from the outset, the idea of this Quintal as a place to gather and make music, and we had these ideas of inspiration around music, and also these climatological challenges that I mentioned that were involved in the design of this central space. But we wanted to express that music tradition, the musical traditions of Cabo Verde, directly into the fabric of the facade, and ended up taking inspiration from the syncopation of the Cabo Verdean batuque beat. And this is a music of liberation performed traditionally by women, and also Madonna. There's a version, you should check it out, it's very good. And we formalized it into the facades. We worked with our local team, including Patti Anahori, and brought a Cabo Verdean musicologist into the team named Chita Africanu. He helped us translate the beat in score, and we worked with this translation to create a syncopated rhythm of the facade. We felt like literally interpolating something so important to the culture of Cabo Verde and the staff and the general public, and interpolating this into the building was a way of honoring its place. And the shadows and shades of texture that happen, the sun is very, very high in the sky in Cabo Verde. It's pretty much equatorial. So those shadows cast on the stone create all kinds of movement throughout the day, and the light and shadow that's created will be dynamically changing throughout the day as well. Here you can see how that syncopation plays out on the facade, and the massing as well. So there's also a lot going on here environmentally in terms of mitigating heat infiltration. Yes, we did use woofie. And integrating, and also the choice of material and stone. Stone happens to be, and as I mentioned, stone was mentioned by the local staff, but stone happens to be incredibly heat resistant. So we optimize the thickness of the stone to resist heat, and it's also incredibly salt resistant. So it's one of the most non-corrosive materials you can choose. So the proportion of those openings, integrating stormwater and bioswales to capture water across the entire campus, and collecting condensate and storing water and conveying that water throughout the embassy is also happening here. So again, this entire landscape is designed to flood for that once-a-year flooding event. And we also tried to create a sense of walkways floating when it floods, and these will be surrounded by water. We think it's going to be dramatic and evocative of the marine environment that it's in, and it's also very high-performing. So we're really making the most out of the water that we can reuse and capture during these flood events. This is the diplomatic entrance. So much of what we wanted to consider was the flow of water from the standpoint of resiliency and regenerative sustainability, which is central to our practice. We didn't want to just get rid of this extra water or engineer it away, put it in tanks, which happens so often, but we wanted to incorporate this natural flow into the embassy and the landscape and communicate this to the visitors of the embassy, the Cabo Verdean government, and the general public, so that bioswales, rain gardens, and designing urban landscaped areas specifically to not only withstand but actively embrace flooding became part of really being a good steward and ultimately a good diplomatic partner. So, as I mentioned, that's what really informs our climatological approach. We really want to understand in every condition what's going to happen in a particular environment, and then not only work with it, but actively figure out ways and strategies to make it generative, restoring and harnessing the ecological flows and communicating this through design. So working on the forefront of climate change means that sometimes we're encountering conditions that have been placed for millennia, and sometimes we're encountering conditions that are more man-made and recent. But in any case, though, we have something to show us, something for us to actually work with and design with. And ultimately, this created a space for gathering and celebration, for music and more abesa. Praia should be finishing in the next 5 years, and we can't wait to see how it actually works for the staff and the local post. It's been very well received. I've personally taken models of this facility to the government, to the city, and it's been incredible. Just a validation that they hear when we talk about their culture has been so important for them. So next, where is the sun in the sky? So this is our project at Arizona State University, Fusion on First. And it really exemplifies our thinking through this question in a way that becomes truly fundamental to its design. So in the desert, doing everything possible to reduce direct heat gain and promote cooler ambient temperatures is essential. And it's interesting, this is, you see a lot of these diagrams, especially in the New York Times these days, usually, right? And they're all actually, typically they're red. They're all red or they're all orange. This was actually a heat map that was generated. We worked with some researchers at ASU. We were working on actually a plan for the city of Phoenix to look at sustainability solutions and to reduce the heat island effect. And what you usually don't see in those New York Times kind of, simulations or heat maps is the green stuff. So that green stuff and the blue stuff is actually the stuff that counters the heat island effect. Of course, green, water, all those ecological flows that we saw on the map, right? Those old ancient canal systems. Bringing back those flows and those natural systems to our city is what counters all the red stuff. So this is an educational housing mixed-use project. It's built in partnership with both ASU and the City of Phoenix, and it holds new fashion and popular music departments that are meant to attract students to a downtown with a growing art scenes. There are a bunch of clubs nearby, there are a lot of artists, and the students are really embedded in a wonderful place downtown to create. We, of course, wanted natural light on the interior where we needed it, and especially in the fashion studio areas where there's a lot of sewing and very fine embroidery happening. So you have these studios that have that natural light need, and then the music studios were essentially black boxes. So it was a beautiful way to organize the floor plate. We put the black boxes around the west facade, which was, it's the most difficult to cool. And based on our orientation, unfortunately, we didn't have a whole lot of exposure on the south, which is where you really want to control the sun. We did have exposure, however, on the east. And so the main orientation of the site really put those primary facade exposures on the east. So we quickly began to study the overall massing and found that the more we oriented exposures to the northeast, the less energy was used and the more we were able to control glare. And we continued to look at how to optimize the facade to maximize diffuse natural light and minimize solar radiation using a software program called Climate Studio, which I don't know if Timur is here, but we work directly with Timur Dogan. We are actually at Studio Ma, one of the firms that beta tests the software that they're developing at Solema. So it's good stuff and it works really well. And this led us to a facade design that uses crenellations and facets, very similar to the saguaro cactus that I had mentioned earlier. And it screens any of that direct transparency, and it focuses it on the northeast to reduce that heat gain. The facade's crenellations and screens are composed of lightweight, ultra-high performance concrete, UHPC, which also doesn't re-radiate, so the lower 3 floors of this really will help cool the perimeter of what's around it. And it's framed within a self-shading overhangs and layered over that glazing. All of these strategies are centered around celebrating and managing the sun, and you have to know exactly where it's going to be and when in order to do this well. So we use that shade glazing in the most efficient way. And I have to just say, architects really do need to go on a glass diet. If you may remember, I don't know, when I think maybe 7 years ago or so, Michelle Obama came out with this idea of my plate. And it was like a diet, right? You were supposed to eat about half your plate was supposed to be vegetables, a quarter of your plate was supposed to be protein, 25% were carbohydrates, and maybe 5% would end up being sweets and stuff like this. So glazing is essentially the starchy stuff and the desserts. Glass is like that, right? And we all kind of crave, the sweet stuff, but it's really not good for us. Ultimately, the self-shading strategies we used to optimize glass and reduce solar heat gain resulted in a very high-performing building. All the ground-level public spaces, studios, and classrooms have access to controlled and diffused natural light. The music studios are placed in the back area, as I mentioned, so there's a really nice area that doesn't require daylight on the west. And the studios have optimized daylighting to all of them without glare. And this is a kind of space, creative students being a space that they love. That's a kind of space that it produces. And also on the residential floor levels, we have optimized amount of glass, which really you don't need a whole lot, especially in the desert. The residential floors are minimal, but appropriate. But using the building mass to self-shade created other opportunities for diffused daylight, like the stair that connects all 3 floors. And you can see this kind of light that dances around in the cutout, which is lightly colored so that sun or the indirect lighting can actually penetrate this without adding to that direct solar heat gain. So we've learned from the desert that a little glass goes a long way. And doing everything we can to reduce our window-to-wall ratio saves cost, reduce heat gain, glare, and bird strikes. And I want to just say, back to the diet, when you start to learn that maybe cupcakes, which, as I mentioned, like glass is kind of the bad stuff because you can only get about an R of 5 or so eventually out of glass, even super, super high-performing glass. So if you think about it, cupcakes, while they look very pretty, once you know what they're doing to your insides, you tend to not want to see them anymore. They don't necessarily look so good. Broccoli starts looking really attractive. And so your eyes adjust to this. Your eyes adjust to the fact that we're not relying on glass all the time. And it's very hard for me personally, once your eyes adjust, to walk around a city like New York and see towers of all glass that seem to go to infinity. It hurts my heart. We've learned from the desert that a little glass, again, goes a long way, and doing everything we can to reduce that really does help. And we can do that without compromising appropriate access to daylight or functionality or beauty. The facade design, along with the use of low-mass materials and the introduction of urban bioswales, reduces the heat island effect. Choosing to design to minimize the use of glass reduced direct heat gain by over 80%, and our self-shading facade design reduced heat gain by about 17%. This project opened in 2023 and has been considered a great success. So our next question, how do we have a positive ecological and social impact on a site? At Scottsdale's Museum of the West, this project allowed us to really think about what the West and what a museum about the West means to us. So we're, of course, lovers of the West, of the desert, and Arizona, so this was, of course, a very provocative question. And the goal of the museum's director and their board was to have a museum where the Old West meets the New West. The West being, in many ways, culturally and historically codified, and of course, constantly changing, but we wanted to have a positive impact on the site and introduce the public at large to an experience that put them in touch with the qualities of the West that restored a connection to this epic natural landscape within this urban context. The site is adjacent to Old Town Scottsdale, which is a remnant and somewhat themed Western town and a portion of downtown. We wanted to connect the public to the more timeless qualities of this place, taking cues and lessons from Mesa Verde, the ancestral home of Pueblos. And just in this case, if you don't know, the cliff dwellings are amazingly designed. It's sited to take full advantage of passive solar design, which it's doing right now in the winter, and that's when the sun's low, but when the sun's high, it's completely shaded. Very effective. The sky, shade, the play of shadow and light, the weathering and mineralizing of surfaces, the cliffs, and the references to romantic and lyrical celebrations of natural forms found in weavings and tooling, and a backdrop for the stories of the West, both of loss and prospect. There was also an idea of finding your own path, your own journey through the museum, which introduced this idea of spaces that rotate around a grounding element, in this case, a courtyard, and a place to connect your experience to the sky, and the cardinal directions became the organizing design move. The cardinal directions being very significant in terms of indigenous thinking in this area in particular. The courtyard acts as the place to return to, and you find yourself in these various galleries moving through spaces. You can always locate yourself in reference to the sky and a reference to the courtyard. The overhangs and cantilevers provide big moments of shade, all part of exploring that productive tension and encounter between Old West and New, between what exists and what's discovered. Deep shadows and shade on the south actually protect and cool the masses below. We located the more massive materials, the tilt-up concrete, beneath these cantilever galleries, and that shaded the entrances and plaza below. And you can see how that plays out here in these very dramatic shadows that occur and shade that occurs as you move around the building. So self-shading and that idea of the New West meeting Old West informed our formal and material moves. As I mentioned, tilt-up concrete walls that are vertically self-shaded with deep ribs that we exaggerated so they would crack naturally. Folded and undulated weathered metal that takes its inspiration from snake fences in the landscape to horizontally self-shade. The courtyard, along with the self-shading strategies, resulted in a very high-performing building that optimized daylighting and reduced energy. And it invites the visitor to really think about where they are in space, to look up at the sky and orient themselves, relating back to this idea about where the sun is in the sky. It also provides a way to exhibit water collection and conveyance. The condensate in the building and the roof drains divert and collect water across the courtyard, which is expressed on this weeping wall on the north face of the courtyard as well, the north being also culturally significant. Our architectural interventions are about creating visitor comfort, which also led to the larger public plaza surrounding the museum. Water from this weeping wall then gets diverted through runnels across the plaza and under the building, giving a new space in this plaza for trees and native plants to grow, for inviting someone to see this relationship between water and shade. The museum then becomes the story of the West, a place to experience, not only to look at the actual programmed curatorial exhibits inside, but also to begin to have a relationship with its desert home, with the West, both in idea and reality. And this happened to cost about 30% of the cost of most museums because it's constructed like big box shopping centers with tilt-up and with steel metal joists. So there's no excuse. The last idea that I want to talk about today is how we can produce or create more than we take. It's a stretch to think of a building as an energy, water, and ecological production machine, but that's how we think of every building's potential. So this is the design of a new research building that's dedicated to answering this question. The home of Arizona State University's Global School of Sustainability, ISTB7 houses ASU's researchers who are focused on decarbonization. So I walked you through some basic principles we used for our office, which we called the Zero Studio, by the way. And we've been grappling with this design problem from the beginning of our practice. And I'll walk you through this concept project, which has now become our North Star. Thinking in more of a closed-loop system means driving down energy use as much as possible, reducing embodied carbon of the materials that you're using, and recycling 100% of your water on site. This has been done before. Attempts at a 100% closed-loop system at Biosphere 2 failed. But the principles, technologies, and concepts can all be utilized towards achieving closed-loop principles within an open-loop system, ideally by contributing more nutrients and oxygen to the planet. Located at the far northeast corner of ASU's Tempe campus, this site had a light rail stop, one of those water-conveying canals that I've been talking about that crisscrosses the city, and the main sanitary sewer line for the entire campus, which actually needed to be enlarged. So all of the wonderful ingredients needed to propose some alternative thinking. Using the principles we've reviewed to reduce solar heat gain through self-shading, using natural ventilation, night flushing, and reducing air exchanges by pre-cooling air in semi-conditioned spaces, and cleaning returned air through green wall biofilters, this all reduces the amount of energy needed to offset with on-site photovoltaics. And in this case, the total amount of photovoltaics needed are supported on the overall area of the site. Reducing as much potable water use as possible, and then collecting any rainwater and fully recycling 100% of all sanitary wastewater on site through a series of mechanical and biological treatment stages, including hydroponic reactors and wetlands that are brought directly into a central biome within the center of the facility. These facilities actually exist at various scales around the country, including at Emory University, where wastewater is treated and then used to grow food in greenhouses. In Phoenix, Arizona, we've been treating our wastewater to use to cool our nuclear power reactor, as I mentioned, but we'll soon be treating that water to fully potable. Reducing embodied carbon through the use of cross-laminated timber will sequester carbon, while integrated direct air carbon capture can collect carbon, store it in the soil within the biome, and through the process of mineralization, use it to eventually make paving. This all sounds a little wild, but the technologies all exist. And the researcher Klaus Lochner, whose department is located in this building, is advancing carbon capture, passive and active technologies that can be incorporated into facades, reducing embodied carbon and sequestering and capturing as much as possible in the built environment through these new technologies will likely increase the availability of new materials eventually, carbon sequestering paving and masonry and concrete, in addition to some wood and clay and soil-based materials that can also be very low carbon. So the design uses terracotta, CLT, and the roof forms allow both solar and water collection. Each facade is shaded, and the biome is envisioned as a semi-enclosed space that shades, collects water, and promotes air circulation. Each facade is shaded, and the biome is envisioned as semi-enclosed space that shades, collects water, and promotes that air circulation. And so you can see the different kinds of elements here, the biome, carbon capture directly on the facade, and reciprocating wetlands. The light rail happens to go directly through the building, which in reality didn't happen, unfortunately and sadly, because that was a pretty cool moment. But you can see here the facades really do kind of speak to what can become if you embrace this idea of regenerative design. So we're looking now at the interior of the building as a massive ecosystem. This is designed as a fully regenerative building that produces as much water as it uses, treats and recycles all of its own wastewater, and sequesters more carbon than it produces. Here you can see what this feels like, to be within a regenerative building environment that gives more than it takes. We also had fun thinking about ways that AI could participate. Farming robots, swarming robots, maybe robots that can dynamically shade or produce energy. We can tell them what to do, by the way. As architects, we can articulate the vision, lead teams, inspire, and design the decarbonized future. And I believe we as architects are in the best position to do so. But we have to engage in it in order to lead. We must harness the tools and lead engineers and scientists and private capital and all kinds of capital and our clients towards this purpose. So I want to leave you with this idea and belief that we all have the tools to improve the situation on our planet, and that these tools don't need to come at the expense of something else. So often I think we're given false binaries between cost effectiveness and sustainability, or between social justice and formal beauty. But in our practice, we believe that these are all interdependent, that a more sustainable building is one that's actually steeped in social justice, that it's ultimately more cost effective to do the right thing and build it better, and that architects have a tremendous responsibility, capability, and power to improve the planet. And I hope that these projects have shown you what's possible and given you a sense of the range that not only Studio Ma has, but that all of us could have, and that you feel inspired to continue to rededicate yourself to using architecture to solve the world's problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiana. That was so inspiring. I'm not really sure what my question is, but it's something about Cornell. So you went to school here.
I did.
30 years ago, is that possible?
I graduated 30 years ago, yeah.
So you were a child prodigy.
You're so incredibly sweet. Thank you.
So you had some of the faculty.
Absolutely. Andrea was my first professor when I was in high school, actually.
Wow.
So thank you for coming, Andrea.
John was here.
And John, yeah.
Was here. I'm wondering, I imagine 30 years ago, I don't know if the word sustainability or bioclimatics, like how much a part of your education was that, and how is it that it still seems kind of like a special thing? You know, it seems like
that's a good question.
Why isn't everybody doing this all the time? But I wonder. I guess I'm wondering, like, how maybe if you're kind of a trailblazer in this area, is your education at Cornell kind of like was it a springboard to that, or how did those two things come together?
We learned how to work very hard here. And to never give up. And we actually, we have very thick skin. And that all helped. Because you need thick skin to do any of this work. So we took a little diversion, Chris and I, in a couple of ways. I think I may only talk about one. The other one would have to wait for dinner. But the first one was we actually studied in Norway. And we studied with Sverre Fenn and at the Arkitekthøgskolen in Oslo. And it was kind of off the reservation, as it were, in terms of being here. It wasn't a sanctioned program. I was inspired by him when he came to the school to lecture. And I also went on a wonderful summer trip with John Miller around Great Britain and Scandinavia. And so I'm talking about Scandinavia and that school, the Arkitekthøgskolen in Oslo in particular, because Norberg Schultz was there, okay? And so this idea of genius loci and place-based architecture, it was very different than Cornell. I arrived and they were making bricks. They were measuring everything. They were doing projects and just measuring their body relative to kind of very tactile, very real things. And they also worked a whole lot less. But we learned a lot there. And we learned that in their culture, and nobody really cared if we did our work or that we didn't. It was kind of, everyone cared so much here, which was beautiful and intense. But that was a good lesson because, we were kind of out there a little bit. And being out there is okay. And so I think the idea and concept of place-based architecture was born there, and maybe somewhat counter to what we were experiencing here at the time, which there was a lot of kind of deconstruction happening, which was interesting, and analyzing a lot. But all of the lessons and all of the work and all of the spatial, I mean, I think some of the things I learned in first year just about spatial relationships and, all of that's still all there, right? It's just understanding maybe a larger validity that I think I was always looking for. And, being on an island that's disappearing, literally, it motivates you. So, yeah. I hope I answered your question. But why isn't everyone doing this? I think we're living with the remnant of an old system. I think we're living with the remnant of disciplines that are very separated. If I could construct my ideal universe of learning, I would have planning, and I would have landscape architecture, and I would have sustainability and architecture all in one place, and they'd all be working together. And I'd throw some researchers in to kind of, really, I mean, you guys are at one of the most preeminent research universities in the world, right? All of the stuff I was talking about, it all exists, but it's never been done in one place. You have such an opportunity here to go meet these researchers and figure out how to solve these problems. And I really, truly believe it's a design problem of the 21st century. This is it. We have to undo the 20th century.
Thank you, Christiana, for, as Caroline says, a really inspiring lecture. I wanted to ask you on this theme of regeneration and producing or giving back, and also, I think there was some other aspect to your work, whether you would be interested in, or you're thinking about, let's say, taking on another aspect of all that, which would be the whole circularity movement now, and I wonder how you would do it, in the sense that, I'm curious how you would approach that. I mean, I know there are lots of logistical issues having to do with scaling up circularity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the kind of scales of projects, having to do with institutions. It might be not so easy to do the kind of, funky second use kind of things. But I'm curious whether that would be anything that you would be interested in, and how would you think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's essential to the way that we think. I mean, we always do the best we can within those principles, and I say that because, if you think about what our existing cities look like right now, and how much embodied carbon there is everywhere, right? I'm not a proponent of always, it always has to be renovating, everything is sacred, because actually we found that it's not always the case. You have buildings that are horrible, they're poorly oriented, they're intractable, but you know what, you can always use them for something else, and it's like harvesting. The extraction needs to happen in our cities. We need to start extracting our cities and transforming them one by one, right? It's transforming buildings and harvesting materials from buildings. Very much like our studio, we didn't do a whole lot. It didn't take, I mean, I'm not saying everybody in my office is probably rolling their eyes. No, it took a tremendous amount of work. I'm not saying that, but the physical materiality, when you count it, it was actually ended up being carbon sequestering because of the screen, right? It didn't take a lot of material. And when you use small dimension lumber, you can do incredible things with that. It's so economical and so easy. So I just want to challenge this idea that it's some foreign thing. It's like we can do as much as you can wherever you have a condition, but think that way, right? Because when you think that way, you see the world differently. Your lens has been altered, right? You see instead of seeing this drab, horrible building, you say, hey, what has it got to offer? Like, what can we take and repurpose? What can we take and adapt and transform into something else? And as far as new materials go, it's tough, right? I mean, building an embassy, for instance, I mean, that's supposed to be a 500-year building, right? So you have to make some tough decisions about that. When do you use stone? It was hard, right? You're like, okay, What's going to resist corrosive salt air? What's going to do these? Well, it turns out, and everyone locally knew that the stone was the best material to use. It takes a lot of stone to build an embassy, but we tried to combine it with other materials and tried to minimize it and thin it out as much as we could, use it wisely, right? Judiciously and carefully, and you just do what you can. You do as much as you can. And there's so much material science that I think has to happen now to really make things truly circular. And that's exciting. It's really exciting stuff. So I think architects should be involved in that, right? And involved in like material design, involved in that kind of problem. These are all amazing design problems. And I want to just say that architects should be leading this. I believe that truly. There's so much here for architects. It keeps us employed, right? Don't let corporations and don't let McKinsey and consultants take our jobs from us. There's a lot that we have to offer as architects. It's a tremendous design problem.
Thanks, Christiana, for the inspiring work and lecture. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the clients, because you've had the office. You both had the office for 20 years. Mm-hmm. Most of the projects we've seen are probably the last 3-4 years finished. So you're showing us of the last 10 minutes of the film, and actually the level of environmental, technological, conceptual sophistication of how these buildings perform. You're actually doing them with institutional clients, a museum, a university, the GSA, and I cannot think of too many more complicated clients than probably the GSA. So maybe you can expand whether that idea of the voice of others, in this case the client, has served more as pushback, sort of the holding the reins, or actually as the trampoline to allow you to jump higher?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean both. We've more like, we're more like acrobats. I don't know. I feel like we have to remain extremely flexible. And in that flexibility, though, there's resilience, right? The stick that bends is the one that doesn't break, right? Meaning that we've trained ourselves very well to be excellent listeners, and I think in the case of like how I view clients, there's always something to learn. So I approach the work with a kind of empathy, and while still leading design, but there's a kind of transference that happens in that, meaning I want to really understand what's driving them. I want to really understand what is motivating them to do what they're doing, because they're spending a lot of money. Whatever they're going to do, they're going to spend a lot of money, right? So I take that with a deep sense of responsibility and to get to what their goal is at the highest level. So I work really hard to do that, to understand really what they want and really where they're coming from. Because without that understanding, you're kind of, you're decorating. I mean, I don't mean to be pejorative about it, but you're kind of decorating, you're decorating. Oh, look at that pretty thing. What are you really trying to achieve with your mission, and what are you trying to get done, right? Let me help you do that. Let me figure out what that is. And sometimes that takes a lot of like peeling the onion, and we do that work. And that actually presents itself in many ways in planning. So I say that we actually do a lot of planning. And I've even consulted university presidents before. I mean, I do that kind of work because it's fascinating to me. And I guess I'll just share that one of the first professional jobs I had was actually working for NYU Law School, and I had to renovate their law school dean's suite. So I had literally 12 lawyers that I had to please and work with and deal with, and I learned a lot from that. So I don't know if I answered your question. I tried. Sure.
Zoom wants to hear you.
Feeling a bit old, but great.
Aw.
Really fantastic to see how your work has evolved over time. But since you brought Sverfen up, which was April 1991, and you might want to ask me why I remember that, because I delivered my child by cesarean about 8 days before that, and I was late, and I had invited Sverfen here because we had met him in Norway on the summer program, and I was not going to miss this lecture. So I remember crawling up to Jaden and crawling in the back. You know, you can't really stand up after a cesarean because
I had
it's
no
almost
idea.
been gutted. And it was the most magical talk that I've ever heard. And I just talked about him again about a week ago in the drawing class in this room. And I don't think there's any freshmen here. But he always started with a diagram, a sketch. It always had to do with sight, like all the projects that you've just shown, but even the Biennale, the Nordic Pavilion, was a drawing that had to do with the atmosphere, the environment in which the project was going to exist. So I'm wondering, and of course times have changed, but how do you start a project? Like, is it with a sketch? Or is it with an accumulation? And I'm not giving any value. I mean, that's maybe how I might start. Or do you start with information and the site, expanding trying to document in maybe many different ways the context in which you're working, the environmental context? Like, how do you begin a project?
We definitely still sketch, and maybe I should have included some of those here, Andrea. So thank you.
But how do you begin? Like, do you go out to the site? Do you read the
Yeah.
brief? Do you do analysis? I just think it's really important for students to begin to imagine how does one what is the process of design with this expanded understanding of context?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I would call it kind of place knowing, understanding where you are, and understanding the context has so many different implications, right? And I mentioned this when Jose asked me that question, but the seeing things through others, or understanding and empathizing with people and trying to understand what those goals are through their eyes. Meaning, how are you envisioning this place? Like, what are you thinking about? And trying to understand those larger aspirations are one of the things that we find really important, just to be able to kind of gauge our approach. And it does influence our design, absolutely. Understanding and looking at views, looking at, when you approach the site, looking at orientation, really understanding where the flow of nature and water is happening. So I think Glenn Murcutt did this most beautifully. I saw in a lecture where he just showed kind of a stone on a hill and how water flows around it. But just simple things to understand where natural flows occur, and whether or not where you are when you're standing is somehow part of a natural ecology that you might be having an impact on, or if there's something that's maybe disrupting some larger flow of either water or sun or something that you could restore, right? So kind of seeing it through the eyes of like, how can we make a place feel better and restore something? Like for Praia, we began, there are a ton of programmatic requirements, right? So you have to fully understand a program and analyze that program and kind of understand the bulk of what you're dealing with. Like does this want to be a tall thing, a wide thing? It's just how is it situated? And I actually remember going through the process that you use at the State Department. You have to come up with like 3 different ideas. That's the idea. And so I remember we were working through that process, and we ended up coming up with a fourth idea. And I was actually sitting at my desk, and I was like, hey, if you take these things, you could actually make this really amazing space. And so that was in model, too, just loose models that we make in the studio. And we did iterative models to understand how that space might be created, and then, sectionally what was happening through that site. And so models and sketches and also a deep understanding of a place by visiting it and experiencing it and being there. Those are all part of it. It's a lot.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you for your lecture. I have a quick question about how do you negotiate all the technical, so let's say you work a lot with landscape architects or everything to do with the water systems and treatments. How do you gain that knowledge, or how do you negotiate being the architect, the designer, but also understanding the technical difficulties?
That's a great question, too. And we have to be educated enough to know what the vision and the goals are. But we don't need to know exactly how to get it done. But you have to have the vision, right? So you have to know enough to know what can be done. Because we worked with a lot of very sophisticated engineers, like the most sophisticated. And I will tell you that they're not going to do anything different than what they usually do unless you truly engage them and show them that you want to achieve something at a different level. So you have to set the bar, you have to set the goals, and you have to have a basic understanding of those systems to be able to know how they work or why they work, but you don't need to actually design them yourself, right? That's why you have consultants. But you have to orchestrate that, and you have to also, set your bar really high to make sure that they're delivering on that, which takes a lot of hand-holding, and, it's demanding. It's demanding. And I don't know if people are used to having that relationship. You have to drive. We call it driving the project. You have to drive it. So you have to be in the driver's seat. Yeah. Yeah? Okay. Is there a question? Oh. From Pamela Karimi. Thank you for your insightful lecture. Or I don't have to read it, do I? Or should I read it? I especially enjoyed the final project at ASU you presented and appreciate this example of thoughtful design you've created. I'm also intrigued by the meaning of your firm's name in Japanese. As someone who studies the deserts of the Middle East, I find it fascinating that Ma in Persian means us. Oh, that's beautiful. Referring to a collective, while in Arabic, with an emphasis on A, means water. Oh, that's so cool. I wanted to ask you, I didn't know that. Thank you, Pamela. I wanted to ask if you've explored other experimental projects in the Arizona desert in addition to Biosphere 2, such as examples of, yes, Palos Solares, Arcosante. If so, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on these initiatives. Well, we're actually going to take our students, Maggie and I are going to take them on a trip, because we do have a desert studio we're doing together, and from October 7th through the 11th, we're going to be touring those places. So yes, we know them. We're going to go to Cosanti, probably not Arcosante. I don't think we have time to go up to Arcosante. So Paulo Soleri created what was called an arcology. It's a pretty wild idea, very organic. But yes, the desert is home to a lot of alternative ways of thinking about the environment and nature and architecture. So it's a great place to be. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Oh, there's one.
One more.
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. It has been incredible. I have maybe a little bit more technical questions in terms of materiality.
Sure.
You mentioned about this recommendation about getting rid about glass. So I wonder which other alternatives have you explored in your work to achieve this kind of transparency, perhaps on high-performance textiles like PTFE, TFE, and in which ways have you tested out to maybe validate their performance or not, right?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question. Gosh, we're so enamored with transparency as architects. We really are, and I get it. I really get it. And I went through this, I don't know if you call it a mourning, but I went through a kind of period of time when we were trying to do silicone air gels, and I don't know, like a lot of, we had a friend who designed a house with a fabric roof, and it was an abysmal failure. It's just, there's just stuff you can't, you know what? When you actually do the science on what you need, I would just advise you to figure out, begin to fall in love with some solid surfaces, because there's beautiful architecture out there with solid surfaces. Just play with solidity. Solidity is okay, and you can work with that. And there are many, many architects that do beautiful things without all of that transparency. Because ultimately, I don't know if you've ever lived in an all-glass house, but have you ever lived in an all-glass house? No, it's not comfortable. We lived in one that had a glass wall, which was okay, but 3 of the 4 sides were solid, and that's about it. And there's your 25%. So try to just see if you can look at other materials that'll work for you in your designs.
Thank you.
Okay. I think with that, we'll wrap it up. But thank you, Christiana, for showing the really, really, I think, inspiring work. And thank you for your lecture tonight.
Thank you.